Powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios. It's Football at 4.
We are about 6 weeks away from the start of Eagles training camp. We'll be getting into our division previews with Andrew DiCecco here in the next few weeks. Probably getting them started up pretty soon as all the teams are wrapping up their OTAs. We'll start to look at everything. We're going to wrap up the OTAs with Andrew, look at the battles that are emerging that we saw and that we'll see at training camp, get his view on it, because Andrew obviously will give us a lot different perspective with these different matchups that we'll see heading into training camp July the 25th. And obviously, Andrew, there are a lot of things that really start in OTAs, and then they'll launch back up again July 25th. So let's break down some of the things that started in OTAs and kind of get your breakdown of them as we get ready for Eagles training camp 6 weeks from, I believe, the 25th of July. That will be on a Tuesday, so that will be coming up here very quickly. So give us the OTA breakdown from you on any tea leaves on the right guard position. We'll start there because Juergens, he was playing some center when Kelsey wasn't there. Tyler Steen drafted in the third round. He got Jack Driscoll. So as we enter training camp, if you were making a depth chart, who would be at the top of that depth chart now?
Well, right now I have to say it's Cam Juergens, and obviously they don't really have a backup center. If you wanted to count Brett Tothan, you can. But so when Kelsey misses time, when he goes off to the sideline, or he needs a breather, which is probably going to happen a lot this summer, Cam Juergens slides over to center, and that means that Tyler Steen's getting the lion's share of those right guard snaps. Which to me, I believe that Steen would need more reps. One, he's far into the position, but two, he's a rookie, and you need all the reps you can, and you want to do everything you can to impress someone like a Jeff Stoutland, whose voice is going to be instrumental in determining who's going to start at that position. But I think Cam Juergens, having been there for a season, obviously he's a little bit lighter, but I think that's much ado about nothing. I mean, I think that playing this alongside Kelsey and Lane Johnson, he's a very technically savvy player. He's physical. So I think that Jeff Stoutland got to see firsthand what Cam Juergens can do, where he's at from a developmental standpoint. So I think that he has the upper hand going through training camp. Obviously, Steen has the more prototypical build for a guard. You want to be a little bit bigger in terms of the interior, just given the nature of the position, handling those defensive tackles. It's a lot of hand fighting in there, but I think right now you'd have to give the edge to Cam Juergens.
All right, I want to follow up on that because obviously Juergens, in OTAs, when Kelsey wasn't there, he went over to center. And I asked this question because we know in the past, Jeff Stoutland, when there's an injury, let's just say Kelsey ended up getting hurt and had to miss some time, the Eagles have not liked to move multiple guys. I don't want to move Juergens from right guard over to center and then have to put Steen in there. They've typically been like less movement means more. So would they rather Juergens just focus on being the backup center, or do you think they're hopeful that Juergens wins that job, or are they hopeful that Steen beats him out?
I think they're hopeful that Cam Juergens wins that job. Obviously, you don't want to see a second-year player in which you've invested heavily in to sit again, have another redshirt season. By all accounts, Cam Juergens is when he was drafted, he's a very highly touted player. But from a fundamental standpoint, I mean, he is so sharp and was so far ahead of the curve in terms of rookies that I was always intrigued when he got on the field, and now I'm really intrigued to see what he's able to do at a right guard spot because he's a smart player, he's physical, and he seems to fit what the Eagles covet in their offensive line. And, I mean, we haven't really talked much about this. Isaac Seumalo was known to be a very smart player, someone that was very dependable, and I thought that was a player that sort of went under the radar a little bit. So I don't think you can discount the football intellect and the technical savvy of a player, especially, given Cam Juergens, this is going to be a second year in the system. It's, Tyler Steen's the shiny new toy, and he has the size, so a lot of fans want to plug him in before they've ever seen him take a snap. But I think right now you have to give the upper hand to the former second-round pick in Cam Juergens.
All right, Andrew DiCecco, Football at 4. Another battle that we just saw kind of started OTAs that will head into training camp will be for that third wide receiver spot. Zacchaeus and Quez Watkins seemed to be the two leaders in the clubhouse. Did anybody else emerge? And how do you kind of read the tea leaves on that as we get ready for training camp?
Yeah, well, it's not really interesting, but it is a little bit notable that Nick Sirianni went out of his way to praise Quez Watkins. I mean, at multiple instances over the past 2 years, he's never been shy about being effusive in his praise for Quez Watkins. Now, all that being said, I mean, he ended the OTA, the last OTA before the lull before training camp with, that practice. He had a big drop down the sideline, and you wonder, is that going to be a sign of things to come? Is he going to be able to overcome that? Was that just a blip on the radar? Because he said and done all the right things by all accounts in the offseason, but now it's translating those words onto the playing field and making the most of your opportunities. So, and earning the trust back of your quarterback, right? I mean, certainly Jalen Hurts isn't going to say that, but when you have a hand in as many as 3 or 4 losses last season, I mean, naturally you're going to be a little bit more hesitant throwing the ball in that direction. But I think that Quez Watkins has said all the right things, as I said, and I think he used those shortcomings as motivational fuel to build upon his shortcomings and really hone in on the details. And I think that it's going to be a really interesting battle this summer. And I also wouldn't discount Olamide Zaccheaus, who is a totally different player from Quez Watkins, has really good short area quickness, much more sure-handed, but he also doesn't give you that explosive vertical element that Quez does. So it all depends on what the Eagles are looking for and how much consistency they get from either player. I think that's going to be the determining factor.
All right, Andrew, tight end. We know that it's Dallas Goedert's world and everybody else just kind of living in it, but they do have Grant Calcaterra, they do have Jack Stoll, and they brought in Dan Arnold. Somebody has to get some snaps. Somebody's going to have to be the number 2 and possibly even number 3 tight end. We know it's going to be Goedert, but what about the other guys in the room?
It's funny. When Dan Arnold was signed, I saw a lot of people, make a big deal about the signing and how much deeper the tight end room got, et cetera. But when you really look at it, Dan Arnold is a one-dimensional journeyman who has bounced around. I think he's been on 6 different teams now. He's a very good receiver, but he gives you next to nothing as a blocker. So when you look at the one-dimensional skill set that he has, the Eagles already have that in Grant Calcaterra, a player who they've already invested a year in and draft capital. So I think that if you're looking at it in those terms, you're more inclined to lean and favor the former draft pick, who also really doesn't give you much as a blocker. But I think there's something there with Calcaterra. I think he can be a little bit flexible position-wise, maybe be able to split out wide or in the slot perhaps. But Jack Stoll right now, barring another addition, would be comfortably the number 2. He is the best blocker. Yes, that includes Dallas Goedert of the bunch. And he does a lot of the dirty work. It doesn't really show up on the stat sheet and oftentimes doesn't show up on tape or when you're watching the game. But he does a lot of things that I think that the coaching staff is very privy to, and he's a valuable player to have. And I think right now, until someone else suddenly develops a skill set that can challenge what he can bring to the table, Stoll's going to be your 2.
All right, Andrew, on the offensive side of the ball, we look at running back, and that's something you wrote about over at InsideTheBirds.com, is that despite Sirianni's praise, the competition will be settled when we get to camp. So you got Swift, you've got Penny, you've got Gainwell, you've got Scott, you've got Trey Sermon, who he has given praise to. So how is that going to look when we get to camp?
Yeah, that's another thing that I thought was noteworthy, mentioning Trey Sermon, mentioning Kennedy Brooks. Now, sometimes that could be just a ploy to keep guys engaged moving forward towards that 6-week low to kind of keep them, in the mix and committed and maybe even more focused going into training camp. I mean, it's going to be really hard for either player to make the team. However, there is an instance or a scenario where Trey Sermon could potentially sneak his way onto the roster. Being a larger-bodied running back that can provide a physical element, you wonder if he shows up throughout the summer and is available throughout the summer, and somebody like maybe a Rashad Penny who struggled to stay healthy and on the field, and the Eagles have very little invested in. I think it's only $500,000. I mean, that would be the player that I think he could challenge for a roster spot. Obviously, also Trey Sermon has another year left on his rookie deal, so I think that also plays into his favor. It's still going to be an uphill climb. I just want to be clear on that for him to make the roster, but I think that if he was going to push somebody off it would be Rashad Penny. That would have to be the scenario, I would think, for him to make the team. And it also would have to, indicate that Kenny Gainwell had a really big summer, and the Eagles feel really comfortable with him being the number 2 running back working in concert with DeAndre Swift. But I think Kenny D. Brooks is pretty much a long shot to make the team, most likely the practice squad. And I think Boston Scott, a lot of people forget about, and they want to sort of discard him, but he is right now he's their number 1 kick returner. So unless somebody proves that they can do that adequately or as capably as Boston Scott can, I think that he's got a spot on this team.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the offense. We know Mailata, Dickerson, Kelsey, and at right tackle, Lane Johnson, are pretty much set in play. You know what's interesting about the Lane Johnson? Kelsey, they drafted Juergens, Dickerson. They've drafted some guys in the past thinking about Kelsey's departure. Nobody really drafted to be ready for Lane Johnson's departure. So who knows? Maybe he has a little bit more gas in the tank than people think. That'll be something to keep an eye on, too, because we've heard so much about Kelsey getting to the end. But we forget Lane Johnson is now, his 10th season coming up here?
Yeah, he was drafted in 2013, yeah.
All right, let's go to the defense. Got Brandon Graham. You got Josh Sweat. Barnett should be coming back. What else does that edge side, that defensive end position have, or is this going to be a Graham, Sweat, Bennett, those 3 guys?
Or Barnett, yeah. I think Derek Barnett, as much as a lot of folks would like for him not to be around, what is your alternative? I think when you have a young player, I believe he's still just 26 years old. He started a number of games. He's provided a lot of crucial snaps for this football team. Has he been the effective player that many envisioned when he was drafted in the first round in 2017? Absolutely not. But to have a player of that caliber who has logged a ton of snaps and is still young as your third end, I think that's a pretty good spot. But the problem is beyond him, there's not a whole lot there in terms of edge rusher. I think that there's the Teron Jacksons of the world, but a player to me that really stands out is Janarius Robinson, a player who the Eagles have played the roster tango amid a lot of injuries last season, and to keep him on the 53-man roster, he was on IR a couple of times. They just did a lot to keep him around. With knowingly, that to me told me that they want to get a long look at him this summer, and he has the measurables. He's young. He's the former 4th-round pick. He's from Florida State, so he has the pedigree there. So I think that he's a player that could challenge for that 4th spot at that position.
Andrew, let's look at the tackle spot because we got a lot of new faces here. We know Fletcher Cox is back, but other than him, you got Contavious Street, you got Jordan Davis, you got Milton Williams, Marlon Tuipulotu, Jalen Carter, Moro Ojomo. What is that room and what is that training camp going to look like?
Well, I'm going to be really intrigued to see how they determine the lion's share of the snaps. To me, they're going to want to throw Jordan Davis out there, and until he proves that he's just a one-dimensional player, I think that they're going to want to tap into his pass rush prowess and see if if that's advanced at this stage of his career, year 2. And I think that you're going to see him out there for a ton of snaps, and you're going to see sort of a platoon, I would imagine, between Fletcher Cox and Jalen Carter. Obviously, Fletcher Cox is in the twilight of his career, so you don't want to throw too much at him. I think he's averaging, if I had to guess, right around from his career, 55 snaps a game. That he's logged a ton of miles. So I think that in an ideal world, you're going to have Jalen Carter, who I think is going to have an early impact for this football team, eat into his snaps. You're going to see a sort of a 3-man heavy rotation in the middle there. And Milton Williams is a situational player. I think he provides a lot from a pass rush standpoint, but he's a little bit undersized. So unfortunately, I really like what I've seen from him, but I don't see him necessarily taking on more of a responsibility this season, just given, one, the number situation, but 2, I just think that the Eagles may view him, and you're basing it off of what you see, view him more as a rotational player that can provide some juice and situationally. And then it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the final spots. How heavy do they want to go? You have Contavious Street, who I think is a pretty interesting player coming off a career season. He hasn't stayed healthy for much of his career. I like Moro Ojomo a lot. I think he's got the inside track. And then you have Marlon Tuipulotu, who is a player who's been given a lot of opportunities but hasn't really flashed. So I think that he would be on the outside looking in terms of those 3 players. I think Moro Ojomo is more inclined to sort of seize that last spot.
All right, this is another interesting spot where you take a look at this team in the depth chart. Obviously you got linebacker. You got Morrow, Dean, and Christian Ellis' name has come up. I asked this question to Jeff yesterday. If I was to say who's starting at week 1 at linebacker, what would your answer be to that?
I would still say Nakobe Dean and Nicholas Morrow, although Christian Ellis could make things interesting this summer. But, I mean, you want to see him be able to build upon those spurts of what we've seen in minicamp and things like that. He hasn't done it for a sustained period of time. I mean, Nicholas Morrow, he's solid, if unspectacular, but he has started and logged a ton of snaps in this league, and he's somewhat of a proven commodity. Maybe might not be the name that fans want, but I mean, he has played a ton of football. So I think that when you have a player that's only logged 34 snaps in Nakobe Dean, you want a player ideally playing opposite him that has a lot of experience and is sort of a veteran that's been there, that's seen everything. And I think Morrow would have the inside track there. That's not to say that Christian Ellis isn't going to make a push this summer, but I just think that right now it would make more sense if the Eagles go into the season with Morrow and Dean as your two linebackers.
OTA wrap up with Andrew DiCecco from InsideTheBirds.com. And, of course, we will start our division previews next week. They will lead us right up to the Eagles preseason opener. So we'll look at that. But finishing up the Eagles OTAs, kind of previewing what's next for this team. You got corner Bradbury, obviously Slay, and Maddox. They're your three. What else is that room looking like?
Well, Zach McPherson's a player who I really like. I think I'm a little bit higher on him than most. When he was coming out, Mike, I viewed him more as a nickel corner, and the Eagles, I thought, miscast him as an outside player. But right now, I think he's going to provide added value being cross-trained. He's playing more slot now in the early going, which is not surprising to me. But I think he's a player that provides a lot of value in the third phase. I think he's one of the better gunners in football. And so I think that he's going to be given every opportunity to cement his roster spot. Josh Job's a player who I've mentioned on your show a lot. He's been getting some outside looks. I think he's another player that shined on special teams in his opportunities and on a unit that really didn't have much to hang their hat on. I thought that he was a solid gunner opposite McPherson and offers positional versatility. I think that while he's playing on the outside now, I think he could step in and provide competent snaps at safety in a pinch. And I also think that he's just a physical, tenacious player with long arms. They already have a year invested in him, so I would think that he would go in there with, obviously he's going in there with some familiarity from the coaching staff. And then Greedy Williams, the question becomes, what do you do with him? I mean, he does not have a lot of special teams experience, and the Eagles have not afforded him a lot of guaranteed money. So he has the name and he has, the cachet, but he's going to have to earn his roster spot. I think when you're looking at it in out of the three players that I mentioned, I think he has more of a steep uphill climb by comparison. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out.
No doubt. And then, of course, maybe the most interesting battle of all at OTAs and training camp, which was safety. You got a chance to see Sidney Brown, Reed Blankenship, Terrell Edmonds, Justin Evans, and Kevon Wallace has been around here for a while.
Yeah, the way I see that shaking out right now is I think that Terrell Edmonds would be the starter. I mean, he's the veteran who has played in 79 games, 75 starts in his career in a very young and inexperienced room. And I think Sidney Brown is going to probably not start right off the bat because there's a bit of a learning curve there, but I would anticipate him sort of maybe platooning with Reed Blankenship early on and then eventually taking over that position. Reed Blankenship is a really good story, physical player, but he is limited. So when you have players, when you're playing Reed Blankenship opposite Edmonds, you have two players with a limited skill set. So I think that kind of leaves you vulnerable over the middle of the field. And but he's a smart player and he's tough and he seems to be at the right place at the right time. But you worry about his lateral agility and his ability to transition and coverage and just overall fluidity. So I think long term he probably won't be the starter there, and Sidney Brown will eventually take over. But that's sort of how I see that panning out. And then you have Kevon Wallace, who every year we seem to have him off the 53, but he seems to hang around. And if he's able to, make an impression on special teams, I like his chances over a guy like Justin Evans, who really hasn't been healthy for much of his career at all. So I would put Wallace in there right now as the 4.
All right, there you go. OTAs are done. And July 25th, Eagles training camp begins. We will begin with, Andrew, our division previews. We'll look at all 6 divisions, all 4 teams in all 6 divisions, and get a look at what they look like as the summer gets here, when everybody kind of closes it down. And we'll preview those starting Thursday with Andrew DiCecco here. Our yearly division previews with Andrew start next week. We'll look at the AFC East, which is going to be really entertaining. Bills and Jets and Dolphins and Patriots, all of them have a reason why they think they can win that division. And we'll break it down with Andrew next week right here on Football at 4. All right, bud. Thanks.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah, man. There's Andrew. Appreciate it as always.